All right, so I want to share with you what my master's thesis was all about when I got my Industrial Organizational Psychology Master's. The title of that bad boy was Differential Item Functioning and Adverse Impact, a comparison of Mantel-Haenszel and Logistic Regression. I know, all of those words are a little crazy. But basically, what I was going for was I wanted to see whether or not I could identify within a selection test, those kinds of tests that employers give you when you want a job to see if you have knowledge, skills, or abilities. Well, I wanted to look at one of those, and I wanted to see whether or not we could assess the individual questions that are asked and see if we could identify whether certain questions maybe had different likelihoods of being answered differently by different groups of people. And so this particular study was all about whether or not there were differences in how items performed and whether or not certain methods were better or worse for doing this. And so I'll dive into each one of these concepts that I was really trying to get into. And the first is differential item functioning. So, differential item functioning, or diff, is an assessment of an individual test item. It's not about the whole test, it's about each different question within a test. And it's a statistical finding that you go through, and it says whether or not one group of individuals has a different probability of answering an item correctly after you statistically control for differences in ability. So it's important to note that score differences do not equal diff. Sometimes there's very real reasons why two groups may score differently. Maybe there's a job test about engineering and two different groups perform differently. Well, if it's a test about mechanical engineering, then of course, mechanical engineers who take the test would score differently than software engineers who take the test. That would be expected and normal. But differential item functioning would come in and try to control for the ability of knowledge around mechanical engineering and then see whether or not there are still differences in performance after controlling for that. Another thing to note is that differential item functioning is not the same thing as adverse impact. Now, this is important because the whole purpose of my study, and I'll get to that in a moment, was to understand whether or not this differential item functioning could lead to or have an impact on outcomes for those who are trying to get a job. So, adverse impact is specifically whether or not there's a different rate of selection. Maybe that's in hiring, maybe that's in promotion, maybe that's other kinds of employment decisions, and wherein it happens at the disadvantage of a particular group. Adverse impact, though, does not take into account whether or not individuals are matched on ability. It's primarily interested in the occurrence and, just whether or not there's a higher percentage for one group or another. An item in a test that has adverse impact does not necessarily mean that differential item functioning is present, but differential item functioning usually can contribute to adverse impact. And that's why I was so interested in checking this thing out. You might be thinking, okay, so this is about bias, right? Well, not really. I definitely care about bias, but diff is not the same thing as bias. Bias implies harm or mistreatment. Diff is just a statistical observance. It's just the presence of diff, and it is true that diff might help you identify whether or not there might be the potential for bias down the road. But that doesn't mean that a test with diff is necessarily going to be biased. For example, maybe there's a test that's used purely for research purposes, and it's simply to determine whether or not there are any differences between ethnicities on a particular subject area. Well, there might be differential item functioning and how those groups respond to the items, but if the results of the test don't bring about any harm to the members of either group, well, there's diff, but not bias. Why do I keep talking about bias and adverse impact if they're not the same thing as diff? Well, because I care about those things. And the purpose of this study was because I wanted to really understand, can I use these measurement techniques? Can I use diff to identify questions within a test to help reduce adverse impact and potentially help to reduce bias and reduce that harm that might come to people? And when I looked into this process, there were more than one methods out there, and I didn't know which one to choose. So I decided to research and to see which one might be the best method. So my hypotheses in this study was one, that adverse impact would be decreased if I used diff methods to remove items where different groups were performing differently, on the assumption that that could potentially lead to different treatment for those people. Also, I had a hypothesis that the overall adverse impact of the test was going to be different based on which method that I chose. So either that weirdly worded Mantel-Haenszel chi-square thingy or the logistic regression thingy. I assumed that they were going to come out different because they used different math. And so I wanted to see if they were different and how different. And then finally, my third hypothesis was that I actually felt like there might not be a real practical significance, meaning I actually thought that it might not matter which one you use. And the reason for this was actually because at the time I had been doing a lot of research and trying to choose which method, and I was getting really conflicting results. All other research and experts in the field were both kind of recommending these methods simultaneously and with really good cases on either side. And so I had reason to believe that maybe there's not a practical significance and that both methods could work well. So I ran the study to see what would happen with these hypotheses. To run the study, I had to actually calculate diff. The two methods that I chose, Mantel-Haenszel chi-square and logistic regression. Both of these are just statistical approaches for trying to figure out if there's a relationship between a variable that is dichotomous or binary, meaning they got the item in the question on the test correct or they got it wrong. Only two options. And then a different set of math for how you control for and then assess their correct or incorrect responses after controlling for ability. And so Mantel-Haenszel uses more of a chi-square approach, and then the logistic method uses a controlled regression approach. I will tell you a third one that came up a lot is item response theory. It's a really good approach to measure diff as well. I didn't go into it specifically because the statistical approach is a little more complex, and I didn't think that most practitioners might be using this approach, but it's a cool one if you want to check it out sometime. I was lucky enough to actually have a test, a real test. It was a multiple choice test that almost 30,000 different people who had been applying for jobs had already taken. So I had real data on a real selection test from real people trying to get a real job. This is just wonderful to have this amount of data. And I took that data and I ran both the Mantel-Haenszel approach and the logistic regression approach on all of the questions in this test in order to identify diff with both of them and cataloged how many items from the test that the Mantel-Haenszel approach said had diff and how many the logistic regression said had diff, and then compared them on various aspects. So what did I find? Well, my first hypothesis was that they were going to have different amounts of items that showed diff. And they did. So when I used these different methods, it turned out that the Mantel-Haenszel chi-square approach actually did identify more numbers of items as displaying diff than the logistic regression method. So there was a difference. If you use one method, you end up identifying more questions than if you use the other method. My next hypothesis was that the adverse impact of the test overall would be reduced if I removed the questions that had been identified as having diff. Now, the way that I measured adverse impact was using this pretty general rule, but it's one that's used in the uniform guidelines and other places. It's called the 80% rule. And it's a pretty basic analysis where you just say whether or not the hiring rate of one group is less than 80% of the other group. It doesn't say whether or not there's adverse impact, only that there's a possibility and that further exploration should be done. When I compared the different ones, you will see that yes, in fact, the overall adverse impact of the test was lower and that it was different based on which method was chosen. I also had a hypothesis that even though there'd be a difference, I thought that it might not really matter in a practical sense of which one would be chosen. And so this was a comparison of how different the adverse impact would be at various cutoff scores. By cutoff scores, what I mean is, what if the company had chosen to set the higher selection mark at 80% correct scores gets forwarded on in the hiring process? Or what if they set it at 85%? Or what if they set it at 90%? So I used multiple different cutoff points to see all possible places where the selection could have been, yes, you are moved forward in the hiring process, or no, you are not. And then assessed it across the place to see if there were instances where either the Mantel-Haenszel or the logistic regression was going to have a big enough difference that it was going to make a practical or business difference as to which one you should use. There wasn't really a difference. So just like I thought, when I couldn't find a clear answer on which one you should use, the clear answer was either one, whichever one is best suited to you and your approaches. So as the takeaway, my biggest implications are both methods are useful in identifying differential item functioning, and that when you remove items that display differential item functioning, you do decrease the overall adverse impact of a test, but there's no practical difference in selecting one of these methods over the other. I should also call out that, there are different things about taking a diff approach that could make the results of this study, more about the classification system rather than the actual methodology. So there's some more stuff that maybe should be taken into account before taking these at face value. Also, it definitely is important to note that when it really comes to selection tests, you gotta still focus on the reliability and the validity of the tests. And I think that's even more important when we're talking about tests that impact people's ability to get a job and their livelihoods and to support themselves. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed learning about what I did. This project was a lot of fun. It was a very big project. I had a great time doing it and really appreciate all of those who helped me accomplish it. If any of you are working in the IO space or done any kind of similar studies, would love to hear about them.